This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
Welcome. This is Deeper Down the Rabbit Hole, and I am Andrea Vitamus. I wrote Hands on Chaos Magic. I wrote a whole bunch of stuff. And today we have more of the old gang back in town. Gang's back in town tonight. And we have actually Jason, who showed up today, which we weren't expecting. He's blamed us totally for that. It's okay. We have Zach here today, and we have Steph. Steph has written so many books. I can't even count. It's like infinite number of books. It's not quite infinite, but it is plus 30 at this point. She's been studying all things occult. If you haven't seen her, she was a co-host for a while. Maybe we'll get her back to be a co-host. I don't know, on and off. She's written several books on demonology across the board. Tons and tons of books, but she also has written several books, fictional books, that some deal with occult themes, some deal with general fantasy, some deal with eroticism, all across the map. And she's just an excellent person. See, there you go. So we're going to have a discussion today about magic magic in fiction, but not necessarily occultism in fiction, right? There's a difference. We're actually going to talk about applied magic through fictional means, which is a little different than talking about occult themes in magic. I want to preface that. Lots of books and materials about occult cultural stuff getting co-opted and pushed into fictional themes. What we're actually going to talk today is about how to use fiction in an applied magical way. I think that's an important distinction versus many of the discussions that occur. So you can see those discussions, just do a YouTube search, you'll see them. But we're going to actually say about how to actually use writing as a magical, both low and high magical acts, and how you can use it as a practical way to transform your life magically, through spell work, through aspirational magic, through all of the above. We'll see how far we get. And we're in a pre-show, we already decided we're going to have another show just about paper talismans, paper books, and how to actually use those. Now we're going to actually talk about the act of writing. And we had a long discussion, as we do right before we come on to Deeper Down, on this topic so we can get the juices flowing. We have so many juices flowing right now about different ideas. So let's kick it off to Stephanie, who had, one of the first ideas she had, is the idea that in Egyptian magic, when we start right from there, all spoken and written word is magical, which is very different than our modern take on it.
Right. Well, and if you think about it, like most of the people who knew how to write were the priests and magicians back then. And they believed that when you wrote something down, you basically, you made it happen, even if it was a fictitious scenario, but it was the intent behind it. So everything you said and everything you wrote down was basically a manifestation of intent. And and this also goes to, the things we tell ourselves, maybe negative self-talk, stuff like that. Even if when we're not writing it down, we're thinking it and we're basically manifesting it. So with fiction, that's when we're talking about using fiction to write things down and to manifest intent. I think in a lot of ways, we're actually talking about seeing what's possible and manifesting what what maybe we think practically is impossible for the sake of bringing something into our lives. So we could go on and on about how the ancient Egyptians, the reason they covered their tombs and writings and everything is because they believed they actually manifested, these things. They did all the spells and prayers for a good journey into the afterlife. If it wasn't written down, the intent wasn't there, and a soul could get lost along the way. So, and it made people feel, if they were near death, like, oh, I know that if the pharaohs, they're like, oh, I know if the priests do all this and write all these things in my temple, I will have a good journey. And so there's a lot of things, like when we write things down, we really, in our subconscious, it really gets stuck there.
Yeah, one of the things is, like, even in straight NLP, in straight psychological things, or everyone's always talking about journaling, and we talk about journaling, and everyone's like, yeah, really? Journaling again, guys? I mean, Zach, right? In the Reiki, like, how many people were like, journaling again? You guys are stressing this. But really, the journaling takes it from this memory state, which is amorphous and changeable, and makes it permanent in a literal way, in a neurochemical way. Like, writing the stuff down, like, there's so many experiments that we could actually look at, actual experiments, even with court witnesses, where really it matters a lot. Medical diagnoses, interpretations of other people, where they get the interpretation is completely wrong in memory versus like what people would actually have written down, because our memories more or less change things on a whim to fit whatever story we're in right now.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, if you think about it, writing, anytime you write anything down, it's you can either manifest or you can let it go. It can work both ways. But also, in writing it down and keeping that record, you can also see how far you've come. You can see a beginning point and an ending point too. So,
I think when we look at a little bit older cultures, like Egyptian cultures, but we can also speak of the rune, we can speak of the Chinese, things like we're working in our Taoist book. All of these cultures give a different, first of all, writing and reading was rare in those cultures. So usually people are coming from a much different context. So this gets back to the aristocratic magic show we had. Usually people, by the point people can even write and read, they're already more educated, which we take for granted nowadays, at least in North America. But that's probably not true in large parts of the world. So by itself, it's an unusual skill in the history of mankind to be able to read and write. This is not, it's already, you're at a different, unusual kind of thought processes. It's not normal. And it's normal, but it's not normal in that most people don't have access to it. So it's already something special. But in modern, especially in English, at least in the modern English, we take the words for granted. Like, people say whatever, it doesn't seem to matter. Although maybe now we're rethinking that a little bit, even the spoken word, based on what's happening in the world. We can see maybe even things that are false matter a lot, actually. They could matter a lot. Before it wasn't so obvious. I think before COVID, like, everyone's like, oh, well, it's advertising, it doesn't matter. It's propaganda, it doesn't matter. It's this, it doesn't matter. But it's starting to matter.
right. Well, if you hear something enough, if you hear words enough, or you read something enough, you may actually come to believe it. It's kind of like if you tell the same lie over and over again to a bunch of people, you may actually start to believe your own lie.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and you can use this in a good way. If you tell a lie enough times, maybe we make a pen name and we write it down enough times, like as me and Stephanie have made pen names, we believe that. The pen name becomes us.
Or it becomes a separate character even, or even like a part of yourself, like you're.
or part of yourself that you can't access all the time, which is a different problem,
Right.
which people have all the time, actually, who are leading double lives when they're writing, themselves in fictional lives, and they go off and do something else that they maybe wouldn't be acceptable in one life. They have a totally different personality
Right.
a lot of the times.
Yeah, going back to the go ahead, because I know it was cutting off there, Andrea.
Oh, I said except for Jason. Jason's just Jason all the time, right?
Right.
Come on, that was supposed to be a compliment.
The power of writing, I mean, even if we go back to the Egyptian point, it's kind of like, okay, they didn't have news media back then, so writing was that. So if you wrote down a story and everyone kept saying it, it's good as the narrative that you just created or wanted.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's the thing, too. Like, in the strictly Dionysian sense of theater and writing and the arts, right? It's like this was never so trivial as it is now. Like, the stories and entertainment, very intertwined, right? There wasn't this idea that somehow the spirits and the magic was separated from the stories that you were making up. That's a more modern conception that kind of, oh, this is just for entertainment, and maybe the craftsmanship of the commodization of writing and art is also part of this problem where, oh, it's just entertainment, but if aliens looked at our culture, would they summon Harry Potter or Voldemort like I said to in Hands-on Chaos Magic? I'd say they probably would, right? They wouldn't know the context that was not
That it was fiction. Yeah.
It was fiction. They would think it was mythological. And we draw this distinction between fiction and myth and somehow say myth is much better than fiction. I mean, we could go all Jungian and basically say, well, hey, guess what? These stories keep repeating themselves in different guises. I mean, but that's a whole different argument. But even then, in classical shamanic schools of thought, is there such a thing as fiction versus myth? Probably not.
No, as a matter of fact, I mean, if you hear a story enough and you propagate a story enough, it starts to shape the lives of the people that hear it and believe it or take it internally, and it could shape their actions and how they live their lives. So, I mean, take a look at the Bible, for example. Just, off the top of my head. Look at how much that has shaped our modern culture, even though a lot of that was mythology, parables. They were stories passed on, like how not to be a dick, if I can say that.
We're not a pair of X. You could say that.
But I mean, but people really take it seriously, and look how it has transformed, like, our culture, the way people think, the way people do things, the decisions they make.
Well, I mean, this is actually important, right? Like the Bible, we're going to get hate mail for, no matter what we say. We'll probably get deoxed, whatever at this point. But I mean, the whole thing is, if we consider the Bible as fiction, right? Why do we consider the Bible more important than Harry Potter?
Exactly.
Like,
precisely.
It's actual, right? Or why do people who study L. Ron Hubbard and are in Dianetics consider that more valuable than Harry Potter? Now, if you read that, no offense, it's pretty terrible writing, actually. Alien Xenos. I mean, sure, we talk about demons all the time, but I mean, it's pretty bad.
Well, it's still more fun than the Bible. I mean,
oh yeah, it is. I mean, that's true. Well, I mean, it depends which part of the Bible you're reading, actually, right? Doesn't it? The Bible is the NC 17 book, my friend. In certain parts, it wouldn't pass any R designation in many parts of the Bible. So, I mean, you could read other parts of the Bible. It definitely is an X-rated book.
Right.
Violence, sexual scenes, everything we would consider horrible
Extreme racism.
Oh yeah, racism. Yeah, definitely. All of that. Rape, as Jeffrey said. Yeah, the Bible has a lot of stories that is not too kosher.
Right.
Kosher in a way because it's literally the Bible in the Old Testament. But I mean, it wouldn't. If people really read some of the stuff in the Bible, they might actually be horrified. Like, why is that more valuable than Harry Potter? I keep going back on Harry Potter, you know.
Well,
Just because that's so popular and so many people have read Harry Potter.
and it's literally influenced the culture to a deep level. Like, you can make any reference to that, and just about everyone in the population will understand what you're talking about. They may not get it fully, but they'll be like, okay, you're referencing this.
Right.
The impact.
I know, but the fundamental difference here is between like of Harry Potter and the Bible is the context that we subscribe to it as a cultural narrative. Like, from a magician's point of view, and specifically from a chaos magic point of view, this is their equally valid text, which horrifies people when I say that. But there's probably more actual Latin and ancient magic in Harry Potter than, well, there's about as much in the Bible too, but that's a different show. You know, openly Latin spellcraft in the Harry Potter books that Rowling says she didn't know anything about. Sure you didn't.
Yeah. But no, I mean, it's true. I mean, and you can take a lot of different books and the same thing, and them being fiction, and how much they actually do influence people. People don't even realize how much their entertainment is actually influencing them.
No, I mean, some books are over the top about this, right? Like, you've got all of Ayn Rand stuff, which spawned a political movement. Fiction, right? But then there's other books like you could start talking about that really are transforming people too, and it's not as obvious as the Bible, you know. I mean, that gets into the, well, what is the writing for? Is it the writing that you're doing for a public sphere or a private sphere? Which is it? Like, and there's a big difference because now we're talking about writing for the public sphere is a commodity in a lot of ways. Writing for yourself that happens to leak out to the public is something different, at least while you're doing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true, because you tend to hold, either you hold stuff back or you completely go over the top. I mean, a good example of that would be like Ann Coulter. If you look at her books, and her books are like over the top, she's writing for public consumption, but she's writing to actually enrage people.
Yeah, she's writing
to get them worked up.
Yeah, which is not necessarily the same as it. That is a magical act in itself. I'm convinced of that. Mm-hmm. There's a certain, I mean, I don't want to use dark magic current there, but there's a certain dark magic current about getting people enraged and then utilizing that for greater political means. That's making money off of that. I mean, we can call it dark or opportunistic, but still, it's not our higher natures, and it's being done a lot, actually. That's an excellent point of, hey, she's writing these books. They wouldn't call it magic, of course, because, you know, but it clearly has a magical impact. People clearly get enraged. They're get further and further down the spiral of a certain ideology and pathways. They get more enraged when she writes another book. They keep going down that pathway, you know. Real world physical effects on aggregate as the more people read it. But clearly, that's a book for public consumption. It's not for everyone's consumption, though. It's for a very specific group of people that could get enraged in a certain way for those books. But Ann Coulter also wants the people who would not get enraged to get more enraged at her, because that still sells more books.
Right.
It still does propagate a further us versus them narrative that they're using, like that she's using and other people are using. So either way, whether you're for or against her, it's still shutting down critical thinking and forcing you to an ideological camp, which is a magical act. Probably we could summon a demon and not do as much damage to a person as that might.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, precisely. Because, well, if you think about it, okay, so let's talk about curse words for a second. There's a reason they call them curse words, because when you spit out that word or you write it down, you solidify it, you throw your intent out there. So if you tell someone, go fuck yourself, for example, you are throwing that intention out there. Whether it's fictitious or factual or whatever, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It's the intent behind it of the person saying it and throwing it out there. And it's kind of the same thing. I mean, we're talking about words have power here. And so that means that everything we throw out there, everything we say, everything we write down could be influencing us on a magical level without us even knowing it. So.
I'm screwed. My TPS reports are due. No, I'm just kidding. Of course, speaking about magical writing, and then Jason wears that shirt.
Yep.
Switching, you got to speak so people can read your shirt, actually.
Infidel.
Yeah, so there you
go. A very appropriate shirt for this particular episode.
Yes.
Yeah, very much so. I almost should have worn my Make Mess shirt. It says Make Mess in Chinese.
Because Chinese looks like a mess sometimes.
There you go, right? So a lot of the times, like, we're talking about this public versus private written magic stuff. And Ann Coulter was a great example of public consumption that clearly, while she would not call that a magical intention, because that would be a faux pas in those circles, it clearly has an intention, an actual intention that for all intents and purposes we could call magical, because there's intent, there's an outcome. It's almost classical results-oriented magic. And you can see what the gain is for her in the process and what the transformation is when people actually read that, like you could, from an outside perspective, you could see there is a transformation that occurs. Likewise, there's transformations on other, this is nonfiction stuff that has this kind of effect, but not always. Some fictional stuff has this kind of effect too, but usually people would say it's fiction again, so it doesn't have the same emotive effect, or they think it doesn't.
Right. I would say they think it doesn't. I do believe that fiction does have more of an effect than most people realize.
Yeah, I mean, so how many people started off as Christian on our panel today, right? Right. I'll admit it. I was a Catholic boy.
I was too. I mean, I was Protestant, but yeah.
Yep. And then how many people played D&D?
I did.
Yep.
By all the standards of what they were worried about, we're the poster children for what they were worried about playing D&D. Right off the bat, it broke down our Christianity, and we started using alternate narratives and mythological structures. Literally, did that happen as a result of D&D? Maybe, right? Because our minds were starting to explore a very different kind of reality structure, using fantasy to, in a different way. Maybe not.
Right.
No, I think you're onto something, because think about it.
Well, Lily's question is a great one. What's D&D? Let me answer that one. Dungeons and Dragons. So there we go.
Yep. But, when your modern society being built on a Christian mythos, and then when your mind learns how to use other mythological stories and put them into context, it opens you up. It makes you think about the fact that you're working under myth.
Yeah, but see, I think Dungeons and Dragons is interesting because it gets to the heart of what we're talking about, public and private. Most Dungeons and Dragons adventures are private group experiences, so never intended to be shared, and people deeply associate with their characters in a way that allows them to actually more involved express that use of mythology, right? It's not just like the process of playing D&D is, I think, closer to the process of writing. When you're writing fantasy and fiction, you're actually more engaged with the mythology than just passively reading or television screening this mythology. You have to engage as if you were that character. Like, I think the process of writing fiction, for me at least, is a lot like that. And Steph could speak to that too. But to me, it's almost like when you are writing fantasy, you're engaging a world that you may have created, or even if it's fan fiction, you're engaging a world that someone else created and having to move those mythological symbols around in a way that is very similar to the way that we use mythological symbols in magical operations, which is not passive like the consumption of reading is. Like consuming fantasy and fiction can do this too, depending on how engaged you are, but it can also just be kind of a passive time. You know, television and TV shows can also be that way, although that tends to be more passive unless it ignites the imagination. But when you're writing, you have no choice but to actually engage those different mythological structures. And I think
you're creating your own narrative at that point, aren't you?
Yeah, you are. Within the confines of this structure that allows for it, but you're still a different narrative.
Well, right. I think this can be extended, like, writing, it wasn't my thing, but playing video games was, and creating avatars from there. I mean, there's an unconscious narrative that I'm exploring through the game, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we talked about that, like, for how long me and Zach were totally obsessed with this game. We said this before. It was this stupid game. It's not that stupid, but it was the Cultist Simulator. And it has all these little things that were like, this is exactly like life. Like, you have all these competing things for your time. And if you want to summon an alien intelligence, it takes so much work, but you have to compete with life and sleep and food and all this stuff. But then you can finally summon an alien intelligence. We're like, it's like life. It's so much like life.
Yep. Because, I could totally look back and be like, well, fantasy stories, I mean, that was anime for me, but it's like, where did it really kick off? It was probably Age of Empires and Age of Mythology for me. You have to build up the comic, you got to take your time, and you got to be like, what am I doing?
I mean, the act of private writing is, and in some ways, now we're talking about games too, but you're pouring your imagination, which forces you to actually engage the methodology. The mythology in a more serious way than passivity is going to have effects on you. It's just, there's just no way around it. If you're engaging the myth, it's easy to play a video game and not actually have it affect you either. But if it's infecting, infecting is a good word, but it's a bad word. Like, because it has negative connotations nowadays, especially, but it is more like an infection. It is spreading to your imagination and then allowing it to take root, and then it changes you, and then that actually can,
because you're more internalizing it. You're internalizing it.
Yep.
You're internalizing it, and that's exactly it. You're internalizing it. Once it's internalized, all kinds of things can open up. I mean, again, this gets back to the myth versus fiction. People are willing to internalize a myth. With fiction, they kind of put a entertainment label on it, or video game. It's entertainment level. But
even then, I mean, think about how much somebody can because when you're doing a video game, you become that character. Well, some people may be able to keep themselves out of it in a way to where it is just entertainment, but other people get really serious about it and they really internalize it to a point where it it becomes part of their identity in a way.
Oh yeah, I mean, go to a convention, right?
Yep, see that.
Like not the occult conventions. People get less into their gods and occult circles than people in uh, horror conventions and anime conventions get into their characters and the stories. Like, if you think you go through an anime convention one time and walk around and think people aren't very serious about those characters and try to emulate those characters in their life, guess again.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, especially when they're going to a level of like costumes and stuff, like they will dedicate like hundreds of hours to go there.
Yeah, that's true. And they don't break character once they get into it too. Some of them will, they're like, okay, at this point I am this person, and then they almost like transform. So, that's kind of an interesting thing too. The transformation that can take form when you take on that character.
Earlier in my career as an occult prophet, whatever, when I was LARPing, I could get physical effects that were weird from certain characters that I would play in Vampire the Masquerade, which sort of freaked people out.
Oh, yeah.
And I could nightclubs too, when I went to nightclubs as an invoked character. Not an invoked character, I was actually just role-playing it. But I was so into it, I could actually get magical effects just from that.
Right. And I mean, even like, I've been to anime conventions and stuff. It's like the air feels different there when you start going, and you're kind of like, okay, what's going to happen? Anything's possible at that point. A lot of the constraints are actually much looser on that.
I'd agree. Right. Because people are engaging in alternate narratives. Actively engaged in different narratives that aren't necessarily the same day-to-day narrative, which the act of writing itself is sort of at times a different narrative, that once you're engaging in a different narrative than the day-to-day narrative in almost any fashion, you've broken the constraints of society down enough that from a traditional magic point of view, or like by traditional, I mean even more possibly traditional than ceremonial magic, you're in the realm of liminal, where what we would consider I don't mean classical magic, but I mean classical results magic would happen in that liminal state anyway. Once you're further away from the dominant kind of social constraints to start with in some liminal fashion, like you're on a drug trip, or you're in a deep gnosis, or you're, at a funeral, or you're, that's just weird, or any number of things that are these liminal states that you can go search out. You can search for that really, in most cases, make magic much easier to actually get results in.
Right.
So you should read one of Steph's books, get into a liminal state, and do magic. But first, buy a book.
Well, the interesting thing is, one of the most interesting things that I found, especially like we were talking about like D&D, but you can apply this to, getting into characters, going to anime conventions, and doing the costuming and all of that sort of thing. Is one thing I noticed is when people get into character, they tend to, like before, when they're not in character, they may be a bit shyer, they're not as confident, but once they get into that character, they literally step into another person. They literally step into a more confident version of themselves.
Well, the reverse is also true. Like a confident person taking on a shy person.
Mm-hmm.
Like you've also seen that where like a character who was more reserved in the stories, they take it on. They are that person. Now, yeah, I mean, this happens when you're actually just reading the writing, except again, like I said, the context is different, but it's still happening. It's only the context after the fact that stops it from going anywhere.
Right.
I can't watch Death Note without thinking about how I could do that as a magician. Maybe that says a little too many bad things about me, but it's probably Jason would actually come through with that one, right, Jason?
Totally Jason's thing.
But let me ask you okay, here's an assholio question, but a good one. So what is the difference between cause, play, and assumption of God forms?
Yeah, well,
There
not hey,
isn't really.
right? What is the difference? What do you think? Steph, you were starting to speak.
Yeah.
Oh no, I was going to say. I mean, it depends how you view that. Each person that would change. Honestly, I would say that there's not much of a difference because generally, you're going to cosplay someone, a character that you admire or that you would like to be more like. So you are basically taking on that persona of that god. Like, and when you're working, say, with a god form, and let's say you're drawing it through you, you're pulling in all of those qualities that you need at that moment, and it's making you more confident. It's making you, or it's making you more humble, or whatever it is that you're seeking. You're drawing that into yourself, and it's changing how you feel emotionally and how you interact with the world around you, even if it's for a brief time.
Yeah, I think it's even more insidious than that. You know, I mean, I think it's because we believe those characters can't do anything to our psyche.
Mm-hmm.
And I get into fight with people all the time about this. You know, okay, for all intents and purposes, we could talk about Superman. This might as well be a solar god in any other culture. I mean, like, this would be a solar type of solar deity in most other mythoses, but because we think it doesn't have an effect, so what? It doesn't have an effect. It's this meta narrative that we're telling ourselves about these things while we're doing it that prevents it from it. It gives us an excuse to go there and then say, oh yeah, now the subconscious mind snaps back because we're done. It's just a fictional thing. You know, the difference between that and practical magicians, especially anyone who's any chaos magic background, is that we won't make that assumption.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
In fact, people have not made that assumption so much that people keep getting real results from Lovecraftian magic all the time.
Yes.
Because they're not making that assumption. Because early on in the 80s, chaos magicians were making so many assumptions about Lovecraftian magic, and they just went with it because it was dark and spooky and whatever. But I mean, and actually, if you read a lot of his stories outside of his obvious racism, sexism, and other problems, they are kind of weird in sort of amorphous ways that could allow your imagination to fill in the blanks, which is why they catched on so much.
Right. And I mean, let me ask you, as both author, it's like, you know, once you start writing the story, what's the snowball effect of it dragging you through the journey there?
Well, one of the things when I'm actually writing, I am actually transported to a different world. I actually become the main character that I'm writing about. And I notice I feel the same emotions they feel. I'll be writing and something horrible will happen and I'll start crying. Even though it's fiction, I know it's fiction, but it still has that effect. It still has that magical effect because I'm right there. I'm living it with those characters, even though it's a fictional thing. And it's really interesting because even the fantasies in our head can cause this. And I don't know if regular people realize that. Let's take, for example, there's a lot of people who have relationships with gods, and they're usually sexual relationships. And usually people like this do not have good relationships with a partner, or they're not getting what they need from a partner, from an existing partner. And so they delve into their fantasy world to create a relationship with a being that doesn't, or with a being of their own creation, basically, to fulfill those needs. And it does fulfill those needs because these people really believe I am in a relationship with Zeus or whoever. You just pick a god. But it helps them in that way. But it also becomes a psychological crutch too. So it may not necessarily be a positive thing, because then they're going to go for that relationship that's ideal as opposed to a relationship with an actual human partner. So, I mean, it can work both ways on the psyche. But when I'm writing fiction, it's like if I write stuff that's too dark for too long, I can start causing depression in myself. So I have to lighten it up with something else, or I have to switch gears just to kind of keep myself from going down into that dark place that I may not be able to get out of, because some of the stuff I write is pretty dark. But I think I write it just to kind of explore the darkness within myself and the darkness within humanity itself. So, and it does affect me. I do believe that.
I have to be. This is why I have one occult book published and not the 10 projects. And some of the fiction stuff also I have to be careful for the same reason. Like it's pretty dark, and what I'm trying to explore, I have to do in limited quantities. But I'm smart enough to know that mental breakdown isn't. But this is because we took the safeties off. I think that's what we're both saying. You know, we don't have this idea. There's myth and then there's fiction, right? We have the idea of like, okay, fiction can actually make real changes in your life. So you'll get to a point where I'm like, okay, maybe I only wrote a page, but it's this grisly, scene, and maybe I have to banish after the fact, put it down for a few days because, likewise, like, even when I'm running through the stories, like, they feel just as the other worlds sometimes feel as real as this one.
The mind doesn't know the difference.
Right. It doesn't, especially if you're in a liminal state, right? This lack of liminal state, which, we always harp on the foundations and of magic and meditation and being able to get into different liminal states. Once you get into those liminal states, it really can be hard for you not to experience that, whether it's a dream, whether it's writing, and not your brain starts to think, well, that was real. And especially when you start thinking, well, there's multiple different realities that we might be able to tap into, or any other explanation or excuse that you give yourself, it all of a sudden, well, what happens in that other world can start affecting this world or change stuff in this world.
Another interesting thing here that happens. Okay, so you notice, like, when you're sleeping, you don't have any sense of time. You fall asleep, you wake up, it could have been 12 hours. You didn't notice the passage of time particularly. The same thing happens when I'm writing fiction. So it is almost like going into another state, because I'll be writing for 3 hours and my husband will be knocking on the door going, I haven't seen you in a few hours. Are you okay? I'm like, oh gosh, I got lost in the story. I didn't realize that much time had actually passed.
Yeah. Interesting thing is that we haven't talked about so far is that rituals themselves often have an internal narrative, like that is going on in the middle of the ritual. Like it seems like, oh yeah, it's so structured, but that's not at all the way rituals actually come across once you hit the liminal state. They're much more like a weird sort of astral realm that you enter into a story, and it's okay because it's ritual, right? But it really is more like a fictional story. The general constraints of reality aren't there, like if you're going deep enough. And it really is. You can almost look back at any ritual you've done, at least for me, you guys could speak to this. It is literally like a story. There's a beginning and end. There's a certain journey that happens through the ritual. It isn't the normal every day-to-day thing, but it has a similar structure to a story. Even the ending points of the ritual, like have a certain, even bad rituals can have a certain catharsis that comes out at the end of it. But it keeps, if you're really good at this and you don't break the ritual halfway through, like, which is bad, right? Like if you get scared or something like that, there really is a full narrative in every ritual, a full story. Every single ritual I've done could almost be made into a fictional story.
Yes. And well, absolutely. I mean, and there's also like that, like you could take the same ritual and all of us in this room could do the same ritual verbatim, but we're all going to have a different internal dialogue and internal fantasy that's going on while we're performing that same ritual.
different interpretations, but it would be a complete, if we were forced to tell a complete narrative, we could.
Yeah, exactly.
If the
And
ritual,
they would all be different narratives too, which is so interesting.
oh, absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is of course saying that the ritual is done with people knowing how to get into liminal states, or at least a presenter knowing how to force a ritual into get everyone into liminal states through theatrics and other means. You know, if that's not happening, and it's like a 10-minute, you know, call the quarters and done, and there's no liminal state, then maybe this doesn't apply, you know.
Right.
But anytime a ritual is able to force most of the people into I think this kind of liminal state, we could call it trance states, we could call it gnosis, whatever you want to call it. The point is a narrative emerges from the ritual itself that is you interacting with the ritual mythologies in the same way we're talking about writing fiction and or consuming ritual. I don't know. What do you guys think, Jason? Zach, you haven't said much, but you've been in enough rituals.
Well, yeah.
Story? Yeah. That's it? One word, Jason?
Word.
Well, I mean, your rituals are very well thought out, well played. I don't know how, I don't want to sound like I'm just kissing your butt, but you know what I'm saying.
Well, go ahead. Please do. Please do. No, I'm just kidding. Even your rituals, you know, when you could use your plastic baggies and it still has a story. You're going to tell me when you're calling the cemetery spirits, there's not a full story there.
Okay, asshole. I got some ceramic. We're not going to talk about what he's talking about, but let's just say I got a different vessel for that talisman.
I'm just saying, even when you're like the most like non-tool based ritual stuff, there's still a story once you get into the right place.
Yes, there's a narrative. There's definitely a narrative, a definite start, a little bit of a mini hero's journey, as it will.
Right. If you literally had an anime artist that you're describing this to, and they were writing a manga, it would still be a manga that was well thought of and compelling, because the actual magic act itself was compelling and you were in the right state.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, agreed.
What do you think, Zach?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I've seen Jason do stuff where I'm like, this, I get the narrative. He just kind of goes over the premises. I'm like, oh, so this is it? And he's like, yep. But there's definitely that start to finish.
But I mean, the experience itself is a radically different narrative. Like,
Absolutely. I mean, even if I were saying we do Qigong, for example, I've seen you do Qigong, and I have my own narratives of Qigong, and that in itself is completely different what you do versus I do, even though it's the same form.
Well, even like with, you know, even like when you're doing some sort of like guided meditation, someone is literally walking you through it. They're not giving you every single detail. So you fill in those details for yourself and therefore create your own narrative that way as well. So, you know, we all have different, you know, if you say, okay, so we're all in a room full of candles, every one of us is going to see those candles differently. You know, the way they're blowing, the way that the flame is moving, the way the color, the size, what they're in, the whole 9 yards. So everybody, I think, initially takes anything like that, magically or other, and they take that into themselves and kind of fill in those details for themselves, making it personal to them and therefore more meaningful in that way. Of course, it's not the same thing as like literally writing your own narrative, which, you know, is a totally, that's just going a bit deeper, I think, when you're writing your own narrative.
Oh, absolutely. But the interesting thing, stuff that you were mentioning, that, you know, from that, it's like, well, let's talk quickly over what point of views are, like first person point of view, second point of view, third point of view while you're writing. Like, how's your experience on that?
It is interesting because when I'm writing in a third person point of view, I'm seeing what's happening as an observer or someone who's just tagging along. Whereas when I'm writing from a first person point of view, I'm internalizing. And that actually makes a really big difference, because in that sense, even though I'm writing the narrative, it's almost like you feel a little safer from a third person narrative as opposed from that first person narrative, because the first person, you're completely immersing yourself. And you're basically taking and making that character a part of you, or becoming that character in some way. So, and there's a lot of magical applications for that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, depending what you want to do. If you just want to, let's say you want to face some fears, writing about it from a third person point of view could actually help you kind of still keep a distance, but be there observing. Whereas if you start writing from I, and you write a character that's facing these fears, these things that scare the crap out of you, it's going to become more real a lot quicker, and you are going to end up internalizing it and feeling that fear more acutely. And I noticed a lot of readers like reading from that I point of view. They like that first person point of view, because then they can more fully immerse themselves in the fantasy that the writer is creating.
Hmm.
So,
Except then they still have the off switch after the fact.
right.
Right, because if they didn't have that context, hell, if you didn't have that context even reading the Bible, I would think, based on some of the things that are said later in the Bible, everyone should be getting into magic who are Christians. Just
Right.
because Jesus actually said, if they really internalize Jesus, they should be taking up a healing path and doing magic. There you go. I'll get the hate mail now, but it's true. It's there. He clearly says that which more you'll be able to do, which means if you're really internalizing the story, go do miracles.
Mm-hmm.
Telling you to go do miracles, but there's still that off switch. People just turn it off. They're like, okay, that's an interesting, wow, what an interesting story about Jesus, or what an interesting story about Ganesh, or what an interesting story about Shiva, or what an interesting story about the gods too. What an interesting ancient Greek stories about these gods. And they're actually opening your pathways to actually be that for a little bit at a time, which people maybe they don't want to accept.
Right. Or they just don't have the self introspection to realize that's really what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
So we talk about high magic a lot. We promised that we're going to talk about low magic too. There's a lot of low magic techniques that are easy to do with this. From writing a story. When we're talking about this, I talked about a negative approach, but we could do a blessing approach. But the idea was, if you use an anagram of somebody, or rearrange, that's just rearranging the letters in a person's name in some way, you could write a whole story about what happens to them.
Yeah.
That's straight. If you're describing the person looks like the person, or like their idealized state, or some variant of an online persona of that person, which will still work, you just write it down. In fact, online personas are a type of thing that does this all the time. If you are able to stay in a liminal state, even then, probably online personas have more reality than some people's actual day life to them.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a technique that you could just write blessings for people, or not blessings, right there.
Right. Well, it's kind of like, I think when we were talking earlier, before everyone came in the room and we were recording, I was talking about how I've always written goal lists. I tell these fictions, I'll write down these fictions about myself, but they're things that I want to happen. So I don't say, I want to, I want my book to win an award. I write down, my book won an award. If you notice the difference is, it has happened. This is what it is. This isn't what I want to happen. This is what is. And then it manifests. And So that it is at the moment when I write it, it's actually a fiction. It's not true, but I do it like that because I know that if I write it as if it were true, it becomes manifest. And I've been doing this ever since I was probably 17 years old. And it's always worked.
Write it enough times.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, someone doesn't object anymore. And
it's not even that you have to write it so many times. It's almost like you write it down and then you revisit. I revisit my goal lists every 6 months to a year, depending. And you just read it over. You just read it over as a reminder, and it does something. It resets your brain or affects you subconsciously in such a way that it actually manifests. And that, when you're talking low magic, that is the ultimate low magic when it comes to writing your own narrative, writing your own fiction, and making it a reality.
That's almost classic sigil magic.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking she's sigilizing without the full process. Just write it down, set it away, and forget it.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly it.
So it's 8:58. It is time for us to make a pitch.
Yes.
Since we've been doing this for an hour. So, Zach, you should make 2 pitches. One for the sponsors and one for the center.
One for the sponsor, yes. So if you haven't joined already, you can become a sponsor member, and that will give you many goodies, such as all the past workshops, all future workshops, and our present workshop, only $10 a month USD. And with that, you get to actually ask us questions. Not just me, not just Andrea. You can also ask Jason. You can pick our brains while we provide the material. So it's as good as it gets, peeps. Sign up for your $10 membership a month. As the second pitch,
You got to put it in the chat. Otherwise, what's the point of the pitch? Your story is incomplete, Zach.
And you should tell people, spell it if you have to, if it's got difficult URLs, where you go to sign up.
So it would be resultsoverimage.teachable.com/10-sponsor, right? That link is also in the chat. So you can go there, sign up right now if you'd like to join us for the workshop coming up. And then
second part of this workshop, just to go over that real fast, is we're going to cover some of the actual stuff we were talking about in this, where we're going to work through binding yourself to a character and taking yourself through the mythological process to a more aspirational version of yourself. Obviously, we can't write that. That could be thousands of actual pages, that journey, but we're going to actually give you the techniques to actually take it away and do it from there. We're going to go over that in kind of detail in the second part of the show today. And a word from the official sponsor of Deeper Down the Rabbit Hole now.
yes. So Wuji Xuan, results over image with spiritual practices. So what we offer at the center, we're reopening gradually. We're offering acupuncture in person right now at limited spaces because we want everyone to be safe, but we will be gradually reopening Qigong classes, meditation classes, and rituals, but currently all those will be online. So just go to the website, Wujixuan, WUJIXUAN.ca, and you'll see all our services there.
And where are you located at?
We're located in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. East Chinatown. Live in the stereotype.
Oh, he said it. He said it.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Zach. This is Deeper Down the Rabbit Hole. We're going to pause the recording. If you're a sponsor, please feel free to stay. We're going to take a 5-minute bio break. And if you want to become a sponsor, we're going to actually do real magic. We were talking about real magic, but we're going to actually walk through it. If you're going to stay, become a sponsor in the next 5 minutes, just tell us you are, and that's fine. If you're already sponsored, feel free to stay. You're going to need a notebook for this. You're definitely going to need a notebook and a pen. If you feel more comfortable with your laptop, that's fine. You can do it there too, but it'll be a little easier to pay attention to what we're doing with without having to type unless you're really good at typing. Like, isn't it? You have everything memorized. And then we'll come back in 5 minutes. We're going to take a bio break, like we always do. And then if you're not a sponsor, sign up. If you are a sponsor, just get some paper, kind of just take a breather, take a bio break, and we'll be right back. So I'm going to stop the recording